Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about the expressed powers of the legislative branch of the government. Now, we are getting into a pretty long section here, so I'm actually going to break this section in the text down into what we're going to cover this week and what we'll cover next week. There's just a lot of stuff to cover here, and I don't want to make 45-minute long videos, so I'm going to break it down and space it out a little bit so that I don't overwhelm you with too much all at once. So we're going to start by talking about the express powers of the legislative branch of the government. Now, there are different types of congressional powers. A typical day in either chamber of Congress might suggest that there is no limit to what Congress can do. On any given day, the House might consider bills dealing with such varying matters as the interstate highway system, an increase in the minimum wage, and grazing on public lands. Meanwhile, the Senate might be considering aid to a famine-stricken country in Africa, the president's nomination of someone to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court, or any number of other matters. There is a lot to cover here. Still, there are very real limits on what Congress can do. It is important to note that 1. The government in the United States is a limited government, and 2. The American system of government is federal in form. These two fundamental facts work to shape and also to limit the powers of Congress. Now, it says the American system of government is federal in form. That means that there are national government levels and state government levels. There's not just one level of government that does everything. So that is something that also shapes and limits the powers of Congress. The delegated powers. Congress has only those powers delegated, granted or given, to it by the Constitution. Large areas of power are denied to Congress in so many words in the Constitution, by the Constitution's silence on many matters, and because the Constitution creates a federal system. There is much that Congress cannot do. It cannot create a national public school system, require people to vote or attend church, or set a minimum age for marriage or driver's licenses. It cannot abolish jury trials. It cannot confiscate all handguns or authorize the censorship of newspapers or radio or television broadcasts. Congress cannot do these and a great many other things because the Constitution does not delegate to it any power to do so. So while there are a lot of powers that the Congress has, there are a lot of things that it simply cannot do because the Constitution does not grant it those powers. Still, Congress does have the power to do many things. The Constitution grants it a number of specific powers, and it delegates those powers in 3 different ways. 1. Explicitly in its specific wording, the expressed powers. 2. By reasonable deduction from the expressed powers, the implied powers. And 3. By creating a national government for the United States, the inherent powers. So we're going to discuss those 3 different types of powers. Not all in this video, but in the coming weeks. The delegated powers. Once again, there are the inherent powers, which are those that belong to all sovereign nations. For example, the power to control a nation's borders. This is a power that the government has that does not necessarily need to be stated. It's just sort of implied. It's inherent in the system. There are the expressed powers, are those stated in the Constitution. For example, the power to regulate both foreign and interstate commerce. Congress does have that power. And then there are the implied powers, which are not stated in the Constitution, but drawn from the expressed powers. For an example, based on the expressed power to regulate commerce, Congress has set a minimum wage for hourly workers. So, while it doesn't say in the Constitution that Congress has the power to set the minimum wage, they can regulate commerce, and you can sort of deduce from regulating commerce that they can set a minimum wage. It doesn't say it's not an express power, but it's implied because it has this power to regulate commerce. The express powers. The framers very purposefully created a limited government. Given that fact, it is understandable that the existence and the scope of both the implied and the inherent powers have been the subject of dispute ever since the adoption of the Constitution. Most, but not all, of the express powers of Congress are found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There, in 18 separate clauses, 27 different powers are explicitly given to Congress. These grants of powers are brief. What they do and do not allow Congress to do often cannot be discovered by merely reading the few words involved. Rather, their meaning is found in the ways in which Congress has exercised its power since 1789, and in scores of Supreme Court cases arising out of the measures Congress has passed. Types of congressional powers. Members of Congress head to their next meeting. The majority of Congress members' time, about 2/3, is actually spent on constituent issues, fundraising, and media relations. So it's just sort of a breakdown of the sort of things that members of Congress do. As a case in point, take the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. It gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Okay, I'm gonna pause here for just a moment. Now, in my lesson, I'm gonna list off like Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Guys, don't freak out. You do not have to memorize exactly where the Commerce Clause is in the Constitution. I'm not going to ask that. I might ask you on the test what the Commerce Clause is and ask you about the clause itself, but I'm not going to expect you to be able to produce Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. You know, I'm not going to, that would be ridiculous. So, as that comes up and, you know, I list where you can find these in the Constitution, note that is not something you have to have memorized for a test. Alright, let's get back into it here. Okay, so to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. What do these words mean? Over the past 2 centuries, Congress and the court have had to answer hundreds of questions about the scope of the Commerce Clause. Here are but a few examples. Does commerce include people crossing state lines or entering or leaving the country? What about business practices, working conditions, radio and television broadcasts, the internet? Does Congress have the power to ban the shipment of certain goods from one state to another? To prohibit discrimination? What trade is foreign and what is interstate? And what trade is neither? So these are all questions that Congress and the courts have had to answer over time. You know, it's coming from words directly out of the Constitution, but these words were written back in the 1700s. Do you think that they could have included clauses in there about commerce on the internet? No, there's no way they would have had that scope. So that's why it has had to have been interpreted by the Congress, by the courts, to apply to the modern day. Congress and the court have defined and are still defining the meaning of the Commerce Clause. So it is with most of the other constitutional grants of power to Congress. The commerce power and, with it, the express power to tax have provided much of the basis upon which Congress and the courts have built nearly all of the implied powers. Most of what the federal government does day to day and year to year, it does as a result of legislation enacted by Congress and the exercise of those 2 powers. So, a lot of congressional power has come from the Commerce Clause, and due to modern interpretations of that clause. The commerce power. Commerce generally is the buying and selling of goods and services. The commerce power, the power of Congress to regulate interstate and foreign trade, is vital to the welfare of the nation. Its few words have prompted the growth of the greatest open market in the world. The Commerce Clause proved to be more useful for the building of a strong and united states out of a weak confederation than any other provision in the Constitution. So we owe a lot of our history to the commerce power. And we're going to talk about here in the next few slides how changing technology has had to go back to the Constitution for a modern interpretation of that power. New technologies such as the steamboat brought with them new legal issues and implications for the growing nation in the 1800s. And this comes in the Supreme Court case Gibbons v. Ogden of 1824. The first case involving the Commerce Clause to reach the Supreme Court, Gibbons v. Ogden, was decided in 1824. The case arose out of a clash over the regulation of steamboats by the state of New York, on the one hand, and the federal government on the other. In 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, had made its successful run up the Hudson River, from New York City to Albany. The state legislature then gave Fulton an exclusive, long-term grant to navigate the waters of the state by steamboat. Fulton's monopoly then gave Aaron Ogden a permit for steamboat navigation between New York City and New Jersey. Thomas Gibbons, operating with a coasting license from the federal government, began to carry passengers on a competing line. Ogden sued, and the New York courts ruled in his favor, holding that Gibbons could not sail by steam in New York waters. So Gibbons appealed that ruling to the Supreme Court. He claimed that the New York grant conflicted with the congressional power to regulate interstate commerce. The court agreed. It rejected Ogden's argument that commerce should be defined narrowly as simply traffic, or the mere buying and selling of goods. Instead, the court read the Commerce Clause in very broad terms. And this is going to happen a lot. For these words that were written in the 1700s to apply just 100 years later in the 1800s, you have to have some broad interpretations sometimes. This is just talking about steamboats. Well, what about online purchases? Something I'm sure that we all do. The Commerce Clause had to be interpreted broadly in a way to apply to online purchases. Chief Justice John Marshall, speaking for the majority, wrote, "Commerce undoubtedly is traffic, but it is something more. It is intercourse. It describes the commercial intercourse between nations and parts of nations, in all its branches, and is regulated by prescribing rules for carrying on that intercourse." So it's interactions between nations, between parts of nations, states, people. Commerce is more than just traffic. And one of the sides in that case wanted it to be described as just traffic. Well, it's something more. And Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that quote there. The commerce power. In Gibbons v. Ogden, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce and that federal laws take precedence over state laws. And this is still in effect today. The court's ruling was widely popular at the time because it dealt a death blow to steamboat monopolies. Freed from restrictive state regulation, many new steamboat companies came into existence. As a result, steam navigation developed rapidly. Within a few years, the railroads were similarly freed, which revolutionized transportation within the United States. So this opened up a lot of people to have steamboat-based businesses. Whereas before this, you had to have a license, and it was very restrictive. So this opened up a lot of business opportunities. Over the decades, the court's sweeping definition of commerce has brought an extension of federal authority into many areas of American life, a reach of federal power beyond anything the framers could have imagined. As another of the many examples of this point, note this. It is on the basis of the commerce power that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in access to or service in hotels, motels, theaters, restaurants, and in other public accommodations on grounds of race, color, religion, or national origin. So that's something that I would say that the founders of the Constitution would not have been able to predict. They used the commerce power to enact the Civil Rights Act that said that businesses couldn't pick and choose on who to serve in their businesses based on race, color, religion, or national origin. The Supreme Court upheld this use of the commerce power in Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States in 1964. The unanimous court noted that there was overwhelming evidence of the disruptive effect that racial discrimination has had on commercial intercourse. So, the Supreme Court ruled that racism has had a significant amount of interruption in interstate business and commerce. And because of that, they said that Congress was within its power to enact this Civil Rights Act for businesses. Limits on the commerce power. The congressional power to regulate commerce is not unlimited. It too must be exercised in accord with all other provisions in the Constitution. As but one example, the Supreme Court struck down the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990 in the United States v. Lopez 1995. That act had made it a federal crime for anyone other than a police officer to possess a firearm in or around a school. The court could find no useful connection between interstate commerce and guns at school. It held that Congress had, in this case, invaded the reserve powers of the states. Now, so while they overturned this act, it's said that it wasn't opposed to the act itself. It's that Congress had overstepped its use of the commerce power, because they said that they used the commerce power to pass this act that kept Gun-Free School Zone Act. They said that it was an overstep of Congress's power and that decision should be made by the individual states. Now, it is in West Virginia and many other states, you can't carry a gun to school unless you're a police officer. That's in effect. But this Supreme Court case said that that was the state's decision and not the federal government's decision. So that is why they overturned that act. In more specific terms, the Constitution places 4 explicit limits on the use of the commerce power. The Constitution declares that Congress, 1. Cannot tax exports. 2. Cannot favor the ports of one state over those of any other in the regulation of trade. 3. Cannot require that vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. And finally, 4. Could not interfere with the slave trade until at least the year 1808. This last limitation, part of the curious slave trade compromise the framers struck at Philadelphia, has been a dead letter for more than 2 centuries. So, obviously, that is not, while that limitation is still in the Constitution, obviously it doesn't apply anymore. So, that is not really relevant to modern day, to the modern day. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you all know the different ways you can get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon.